Okay, this is Whale Evolution Debunked Part 2. I'm just going to go through the kind of textbook definitions of things first. Pakicetus looked very different from modern cetaceans, and its body shape more resembled those of land-dwelling hoofed mammals. Unlike all later cetaceans, it had 4 fully functional long legs. Pakicetus had a long snout, a typical complement of teeth that included incisors, canines, premolars and molars, a distinct and flexible neck, and a very long and robust tail. As in most land mammals, the nose was situated at the tip of the snout. Reconstructions of Pakicetids that followed the discovery of composite skeletons often depicted them with fur. However, given their close relationship with hippos, they more likely had sparse body hair. The first fossil consisted of an incomplete skull with a skull cap and a broken mandible with some teeth. So that's just kind of like a recap of what I was saying in my previous video. It wasn't anything like whales at all. It was a hoofed, land-dwelling mammal with 4 fully functional legs, and its nose was at the tip of its snout, whereas in all whales and dolphins the nose is in the middle of the head, the top of the skull. Classification. Pakicetus was originally described as being a mesonychid, but later research reclassified it as an early cetacean due to characteristic features of the inner ear found only in cetaceans, whales and dolphins. Namely, the large auditory bullet is formed from the ectotympanic bone only. It was then believed to be descended from mesonychids, according to Gingrich and Russell 1981. However, the redescription of the primitive semi-aquatic artiodactyl Indohis and the discovery of its cetacean-like inner ear simultaneously put an end to the idea that whales were descended from mesonychids, while demonstrating that Pakicetus and all other cetaceans are artiodactyls. Thus, Pakicetus represents a transitional taxon between extinct land mammals and modern cetaceans. Right, that's a mesonychid there, and it's exactly like Pakicetus. I want to go through the concept that they discussed about the idea that whales came from mesonychids, or the idea that Pakicetus was originally a mesonychid. Just based on observational data alone, they said it was a mesonychid. Gingrich and Russell did in 1981. Then other people came along and looked at the data and said that's not the case anymore. So I'm going to take you to when that came about, and this is one of the references from Wikipedia. And I've went through all the references from Wikipedia, and you'll start to see that in the slides as we go on. So they've done a phylogenetic analysis, which is a computer modelling, that's what it is. There are 2 current hypotheses about the closest relatives of cetaceans championed by morphological and molecular systemists respectively. Morphological phylogenetic studies indicate that the sister group to cetaceans is the mesonychins, an extinct group of flesh-eating ungulates. On the other hand, molecular studies indicate that cetaceans are embedded in paraphyletic artiodactyls and that hippopotamus are their existing sister group. In order to test whether the mesonychid hypothesis is robust against the addition of the new morphological data, we analysed a data matrix of dental, cranial and postcranial characters and included a variety of mesonychids and artiodactyls. So my understanding of it, and it's very confusing if you actually go to Wikipedia and try and find out, right? Mesonychids are the kind of dog-like animal that you've just seen, and artiodactyls are ungulates, which is like giraffes, rhinos, hippopotamus, animals of that nature. There seems to be a bit of confusion in this next part. It seems like they're trying to say that hippopotamus are separate from artiodactyls, but if you go to textbook definitions now today, you won't find that. You'll find that basically artiodactyls and hippopotamus are synonymous with each other, and there is no difference. Hippopotamus is a specific artiodactyl, but they are both artiodactyls. But this is where I'm trying to get across how confusing this information is and what little substance it's actually held together by. So let's find out what they did with this phylogenetic analysis. Our analysis supports Seta artiodactyla, right? So what they've done is they've taken cetacean bones, known whale and dolphin bones, and combined them with some artiodactyl bones, which would be, as I said, rhinos, giraffes, hippopotamus, things like that. So they've combined that as a group and compared cetaceans to that group, right? Our analysis supports Ceta artiodactyla, the clade that includes cetaceans and artiodactyls, to the exclusion of mesonicans, but not Cetae. So they don't even have a proper name for when they put cetaceans and mesonican bones together, right? That's what they did, the next one that they compared it to. There is strong bootstrap support, 77% for Ceta artiodactyla being the kind of sister group or progeny group, original group that cetaceans came from. They are most like Ceta artiodactyla, and we reject the mesonican hypothesis of cetacean relations based on this computer model. However, our analysis does not support the hippopotamus hypothesis either, because we recovered sister group relations between cetacea and artiodactyls. So that's very confusing to me, because when I'm looking at textbook definitions of things, there is no difference between hippopotamuses and artiodactyls. Hippopotamus are artiodactyls, so that's very confusing. But to kind of put that to the side to the moment, just to show you how confusing this stuff is, and I don't think that's confusing because we are not smart enough to understand it. I think it's confusing because they are making mistakes, right? So let me go through this, right? So they're saying that cetaceans are like the Ceta artiodactyla group. The first point about that is there is no such group. There is no such group in real life. In real life there are cetaceans and there are artiodactyls, but there is no such thing as a Ceta artiodactyl. That would be like me saying my face is exactly like my father's face and my uncle's face combined, more so than it is my father's face and my mother's face combined. But in reality, those things don't exist. My father's face combined with my uncle doesn't exist in real life, so there's no point in me comparing it to that because it doesn't exist. Now, another thing to think is that they have genuine cetacean bones in this group of cetaceans plus artiodactyls, and it's only 77% like cetaceans, so that's not even a very high percentage. The fact that when Gingrich and Russell looked at these bones, they said this is a mesonicid, fine, simple. Now they're trying to say, based on this computer modelling, Pakicetus is not to be considered a mesonicid anymore, it's to be considered a cetacean. You're putting cetacean bones in a group, and cetacean bones are only 77% like themselves, and you're comparing all cetaceans to a group of animal bones which in real life don't actually exist. Right, okay, so this is what I'm talking about, how flimsy the actual evidence of cetaceans being related to land mammals actually is. So traditionally the morphology of the ankle has been used to define artiodactyls. Our new fossils show that these defining characteristics do not only occur in all artiodactyls, but they are also present in basal cetaceans. So they're saying that the ankle bone that they found in Pakicetus is like all other artiodactyls, it's like all other ungulate animals, but they're saying that it's also present in basal cetaceans. Now what basal means is just base form, it's present in base form cetaceans, but here we go again, it's a very, very sleight of hand protection of the evolution theory, because there are no basal cetaceans at this point. They are trying to prove that there are basal cetaceans, that whales and dolphins did live on the land. They're the ones who are trying to prove that. So they are saying at this point, when there are no basal cetaceans, they are saying other basal cetaceans also have this type of ankle that Pakicetus has got, but it's not even been proven yet that there are basal cetaceans by this point. So it's very, very confusing, it's very weird, and it's very flimsy. Okay, this is the possible semi-aquatic nature they're saying now, back to the textbook definitions of things. It was illustrated on the cover of Science as a semi-aquatic, vaguely crocodile-like mammal diving after fish, that's Pakicetus. Somewhat more complete skeletal remains were discovered in 2001, prompting the view that Pakicetus was primarily a land animal about the size of a wolf and very similar in form to the related mesonicids. Thewesen in 2001 wrote that Pakicetus are terrestrial mammals no more amphibious than a tapir. However, Thewes in 2009 argued that the orbits of these cetaceans were located close together on top of the skull, as is common in aquatic animals that live in water but look at emerged objects. Just like in Dohis, limb bones of pachycetus are osteoclerotic are also suggestive of an aquatic habitat, since heavy bones provide ballast. This peculiarity could indicate that pachycetus could stand in water almost totally immersed without losing visual contact with the air. Well, that's no different to a hippopotamus, is it? A hippopotamus does that, and it can't do what a whale or a dolphin can do. That's them trying to put the positive aspect of it, but as I take you through and I go through the references for you, I went to all the references that Wikipedia had, I read through them all, and we'll find that even although they're saying pachycetus, they're trying to make it sound as if it was aquatic, it really was nothing of the sort. Sensory capabilities. The pachycetus skeleton reveals several details regarding the creature's unique senses and provides a newfound ancestral link between terrestrial and aquatic animals. As previously mentioned, the pachycetus upward-facing eye placement was a significant indication of its habitat. Even more so, however, was its auditory abilities. Like all other cetaceans, pachycetus had a thickened skull bone known as the auditory bulla, which was specialised for underwater hearing. Cetaceans also all categorically exhibit a large mandibular foramen within the lower jaw, which holds a fat pack and extends towards the ear, both of which are also associated with underwater hearing. Pachycetus is the only cetacean in which the mandibular foramen is small, as is the case in all terrestrial animals. It thus lacked the fat pads, and sounds reached its eardrum following the external auditory meatus, as in terrestrial mammals. Thus, the hearing mechanism of pachycetus is the only known intermediate between that of land mammals and aquatic cetaceans, with both the auditory and visual senses in mind. As well as the typical diet of pachycetus, one might assume that the creature was able to attack both aquatic and terrestrial prey from a low vantage point. Right. Again, this is kind of sleight of hand here, right? So they're trying to tell you how much pachycetus is like cetaceans, whales and dolphins, but the actual fundamental core of what they're saying is that it's nothing like those. Pachycetus is the only cetacean in which the mandibular foramen is small, so first of all, it hasn't been proven that it's a cetacean. Second of all, its mandibular foramen is small, and cetaceans don't have small foramen, so they're trying to say, oh, look how similar it is, but the actual evidence is not there, as is the case in all terrestrial animals. Terrestrial means you live on the land, so all land mammals have small mandibular foramens, but cetaceans have large mandibular foramens, and this is them trying to explain how pachycetus is like all cetaceans. It thus lacked the fat pad. A fat pad is also required for hearing underwater. Pachycetus didn't have that, and sounds reached its eardrum following the external auditory meatus, as in terrestrial mammals. So its hearing was like all other terrestrial mammals that lived on the land, but they're having the gall to say that that is an intermediate, when basically they've just explained pachycetus heard in exactly the same way as other animals that lived on the land. So this is one of the references that I've went to show you where Wikipedia, where the online encyclopedia got their information from. So pachycetus, there's a picture of it there, that's what they're saying it looks like. So there are currently 4 species of pachycetus: Pachycetus anachus, atoke, calchus and chitus. Although many skeletal elements of pachycetus have been found, all were isolated, and our knowledge of pachycetus comes from educated guesses that associate these bones together to form partial skeletons. Given these uncertainties, we have decided to focus on the genus Pachycetus instead of any particular species. So Pachycetus is actually 4 different types of animal combined, and they were found in isolated sediments. It's saying that what we did was we have an educated guess that this was the one animal, but it might not have been. The range, this whale, so immediately again in support of the evolution theory, they've just went basically saying we don't know much about this animal, we don't know much about its bones were found in completely separate areas. Bang, it's a whale. This whale has been found at several localities in the Punjab and northwest frontier provinces of Pakistan. At this time, Pakistan was on the edge of a great shallow seaway called the Tethys Sea, extending from the present-day Mediterranean to India. Pakicetus has not been found from deposits of the Tethys Sea, but instead from adjacent river and floodplain deposits. So Pakicetus wasn't even found in the sea. Pakicetus was wading about in fresh water. These deposits also yielded bones of land-dwelling mammals, so these Pakicetus bones that were found in separate positions from each other also brought up the bones of other mammals. Getting a bit confusing here. Samples from the teeth of Pakicetus yield oxygen isotope ratios and variation that included Pakicetus lived in fresh water environments such as rivers and lakes. So Pakicetus didn't even go near the sea, never mind it was the 100,000th grandfather of all whales and all dolphins. It didn't actually even go anywhere near the sea. Size, as described in the comments above, all known skeletons of Pakicetus are composites put together created by gathering isolated bones based on the skull sizes of Pakicetus specimens and to a lesser extent on composite skeletons. Species of Pakicetus are thought to have been 1 to 2 metres in length. The anatomy of Pakicetus looked very different from modern cetaceans because it wasn't one, and its body shape more resembled those of land-dwelling hoofed mammals. So again, based on the original interpretation of these bones is that it was a mesonicid. The actual observation, which is a major part of science, observation told Gingrich and Russell that it was a mesonicid. So it resembled land-dwelling hoof mammals. Unlike all modern and possibly all other cetaceans, it had 4 fully functional long legs. So cetaceans live in the depths of the ocean. They can dive down to the depths of the ocean. None of them have got 4 functional legs, but Pakicetus is definitely a whale. Locomotion. The skeleton of Pakicetus resembles those of many other even-toed hoof mammals, e.g. deer, camel, pigs, and appears to be adapted for running at high speeds. However, the limb bones are quite dense, a trait that aquatic animals use to keep from floating to the surface. Together, these traits suggest that Pakicetus represents an early stage in the evolution of cetaceans, one where many running adaptations were retained but rarely used. In fact, the density of the limb bones of Pakicetus is so great that they would have been at increased risk of breakage during running. So that's pretty strange that they're saying that it resembled all kind of other mammals and ungulates that we know of, and it was adapted for running at high speeds. That's what the observation tells them. Then all of a sudden they go into this kind of randomness. It doesn't seem to be based on anything, saying that it had running adaptations but it didn't run. Well, how? Where would the proof of that come from? Where would the proof that the bones of an animal would appear to show that it was a good runner, but you're saying that it didn't run? And you're saying, in fact, that if it did run, it would break its legs? No. I've never ever known any animal in the history of any animals to have broken its leg trying to run. Either an animal can run or it can't run. There's no in between where, oh, well, you could run, but you might break your leg, so don't bother running. Animals don't work like that. Animals can either do something or they can't do something, and that's the end of it. There's no in between. Instead, the density suggests that it walked on the bottom of rivers and lakes like the hippopotamus. Given that the hippopotamus is the closest living relative of cetaceans, Pakicetus and hippos may have inherited this behaviour from their common ancestor. Well, that's wrong, because we've just looked at the study and cetaceans aren't like hippopotamus. As I previously explained, there's 77% cetacean bones and the artiodactyl bones together, but they're only 77% alike, and it's based on a model where cetacean bones were in the sample evidence that the computer modelled. So obviously it was going to be like that, and they're not like hippopotamus directly. They're like ceta-artiodactyls. They're like a combination of the two. So that is actually, whoever this is says that hippopotamus is the closest living relative of cetaceans. That's not actually accurate, as we have seen and I have showed you. Pakicetus and hippos may have inherited this behaviour from their common ancestor, which they don't know what that is. The large tail of Pakicetus is possibly a specialisation for aquatic locomotion, although exactly how is unclear. Well, thanks for that random speculation. Pakicetus had a dense and thickened auditory bulla, which is a characteristic of all cetaceans. The bulla is the bone of the skull that formed the floor of a cavity that used the middle ear ossels. The thickened part of the auditory bulla was suspended from the skull, allowing it to vibrate in response to sound waves propagating through the skull. Normally, sound waves in air are reflected when they encounter a skull because of the great difference in density between bone and air. However, the density of water is much closer to that of bone. Underwater sound would have entered the skull of Pakicetus and caused its bulla to vibrate. The bulla was in turn connected to the chain of middle ear bones, which transmitted the sound to the organ of hearing. Thus, the thickened bulla of Pakicetus is interpreted as specialisation for hearing underwater sound. The sound passage via the external ear of Pakicetus was intact and was similar to that of other mammals. Based on this, Pakicetus retained the ability to hear airborne sound. The eyes of Pakicetus faced to the side and slightly upward. Thus, in combination with its inferred diet and inferred ability to walk on the bottom, suggests that it attacked its prey from below. So they're admitting it's an inferred ability to walk on the bottom, and as I'm going to show you in later slides, that Pakicetus actually couldn't hear in water, not in the slightest. Okay, so this is one of the other references that appeared in connection to the Wikipedia. Pakicetus is an extinct genus of early Cetacean mammal known from fossils discovered 48.5 million years ago in river delta deposits in present-day Pakistan. Pakicetus is one of the earliest whales and the first Cetacean discovered with functional legs. Is that not a warning sign? Is that not a red flag if all Cetaceans don't have legs or fully functional legs and this one does? Then it's not a cetacean. Is that not what we should be reading into it if we're scientists? In addition, it still retained many other features of terrestrial mammals, including an auditory system that was better for hearing in air than in water. So they're saying it was like all other land mammals and it could hear better in air than it could in water. Humans can hear a bit in water. They can't hear like what they normally hear, but they can hear in water. It doesn't mean that we're related to whales or we are the ancestors of all whales. A dentition not unlike that of its closest terrestrial relatives, such as the mesonychids, and functional feet capable of locomotion on land. So this now here is the actual bones that were found the first time round, right? So there's one of them there. There's one of them there. And there's one of them there. And they found these, but these were found in a completely separate location to these. And they've combined these together. And they're saying that this evidence, these bones here, are complicit evidence that a dog-like animal is the ancestor of all whales. You can judge that for yourself. This is some of the representations, the different representations that I found from Googling Pakicetus. So we've got one that's like this, like a kind of rat dog. And we've got that one is almost exactly the same, slightly different. Then we've got that one, which is more like the mesonychid that we've seen. Then we've got completely different reptilian ones. We've got a crocodile type one, a marine iguana one, and we've got one that is completely aquatic here. There's no way that the animal in that picture could walk on the land. So this is just to show you that, especially to kind of put it home, that sometimes you'll see articles in the newspaper and things like that, and then you'll see an artist's impression of what that animal was. But to be honest, these things are not scientific in basis at all. They're just completely made up, and we really have no idea of knowing what these animals genuinely looked like. This is a diagram of the actual Pakicetus bones that they are saying they've found, the composite skeleton. And this is the actual picture of the actual bones. So what I'm finding as I'm going through is that when they give you a diagram, it looks very clear, but the actual picture of the actual bones is something quite different. It's very ambiguous, if you ask me, especially if it was found a composite skeleton that was found kind of scattered all over the place in amongst other mammal bones. And that is their reconstruction of what Pakicetus actually was. Now, I'm going to kind of take you through, where possible, I'm going to try and show you what I think the animal could have been. I don't want to be a hypocrite and just be down on what other people are saying and be critical of it. I'm going to be positive and give my version of it, my view of it. So this is a list of not all semi-aquatic mammals, but this is a list. What I've not included here is mostly monkeys. There are some semi-aquatic monkeys, there are semi-aquatic reptiles and semi-aquatic, but this is all the semi-aquatic mammals. So you've got platypus, you've got marsh rabbit, swamp rabbit, opossums, then it goes on to rodents, the capybara, the coypu, crab-eating rat, fish-eating rat, marsh rat, muskrat. You've got the desmans, the sauricomorphs. They are quite cool animals. I only recently found out about them. Then artiodactyls, like here we go, artiodactyls. Hippopotamus is an artiodactyl, but in the previous one it felt like they were trying to categorise them differently as separate things. They're not separate, they are the same. Hippopotamus, pygmy hippopotamus, wild boar, Chinese water deer, waterbuck, sitatunga, nyala, wild water buffalo. Then it goes into horses, the Malayan tapir, the Brazilian tapir, the Javan rhinoceros, the bush dog, the raccoon dog, the common raccoon, the crab-eating raccoon, cats, the cougar, the leopard, the jaguar, the tiger, the lynx, the fishing cat, the flat-headed cat, the leopard cat. Then you're getting into civets and genets. You've got the aquatic genet, they've got the crab-eating mongoose, you've got seals, you've got polar bear, brown bear, the black bear, the common raccoon. So these are all, it's just to show you, this is the amount of semi-aquatic mammals that we have, but they're not saying that Pakicetus was just a semi-aquatic mammal. They're saying that Pakicetus was definitely the ancestor of all whales and all dolphins. Now, see, when you look into any animal, you will find that in the past there were more versions of that animal and different versions of that animal. Every single animal that you could look at, there are extinct versions of it in the past, and probably quite a wide range. So out of all of these animals, right, every single one of these here, there will be extinct versions of these animals going back into the past. And we're not saying that Pakicetus is an extinct version of one of these semi-aquatic mammals. We're saying that it definitely is the ancestor of all whales and all dolphins. And I just don't think that's, when you've got all this evidence in the real world right in front of you, to just say that it was a semi-aquatic mammal. But we're not saying that. So I'm going to go on now and show some of the best examples of what I think it could have been, just to show you how similar the skeletons for these things are. When I was doing my search, I looked at where Pakicetus came from, Pakistan, so I narrowed my range to that area of the world. So all these animals that you see, their habitat was that general area of the world. And what I'm saying is not completely out of the order with what science is saying, because science is saying that the sister group for all cetaceans was hippopotamus, and hippopotamus only resides now in the middle of Africa, far down the Nile. But Pakicetus was obviously from Pakistan, and the range of hippos at that time went all over Africa and right into Asia as well. So I'm not out of order to say, like, the sun bear I think is actually more over to the east, Malaysia and things like that. It's further east than Pakistan. I'm not completely out of sync with science, because science is saying that hippopotamus and Pakicetus, the hippopotamus range now is only in the centre of Africa, but previously it was in India as well. So this is a sun bear. I don't know if you've ever seen a sun bear or heard about it before. A sun bear is a bear, but much smaller than a normal bear, and there it is there in size compared to a human. And there is a sun bear's skeleton, and there is a skeleton of Pakicetus. So we're not saying that Pakicetus was a type of extinct sun bear, even though the skeletons are basically exactly the same aside from a longer tail. We're not saying that Pakicetus was a type of extinct sun bear. We're saying that it definitely was the ancestor of all whales and all dolphins. This is a pygmy hippopotamus, so that is in line with what the science was saying. Some of the things that they were saying about Pachycetus was they think that it possibly could have stood on the riverbeds. Well, so can pygmy hippopotamus. That's to just give you an idea of the size there, because I couldn't really get one that was pictured next to a human, a pygmy hippopotamus. And that is the skeleton for a pygmy hippopotamus. Again, basically exactly the same as Pachycetus. But we're not saying that Pachycetus was a type of extinct pygmy hippopotamus. We're saying that Pachycetus was definitely a whale. Okay, this is a wild boar. There's a granny chatting to a wild boar or trying to move it out of the way. And this is the skeleton for a wild boar. Again, the only real difference is the length of the tail. So we're not saying that Pachycetus was an extinct wild boar. We're saying that Pachycetus was definitely a whale. That's what science is currently saying. I think this is probably the closest, the best version that I found. A raccoon dog. Have you ever heard of that? I hadn't heard of it until recently. Quite cute, yeah, quite like that animal. And there's the skeleton for a raccoon dog, which has even got the long tail, so that's basically exactly the same as Pachycetus. It is exactly the same as Pachycetus. If the feet here for Pachycetus were laid flat instead of what they've got it in a position of movement, if those feet were laid flat, I think personally that it would be exactly the same as that. And I don't know if they actually did, let me see, I don't know if they actually did find any feet bones for Pachycetus, so I don't know if we can rule out that he didn't have claws, even though claws are there. So let's go back, see the exact bones for Pachycetus. They did have some, but I don't think that you could rule out that claws were involved in that. So from existing animals that we know, I'm saying the Pachycetus skeleton is most like the raccoon dog. From existing animals. Now, there's a better animal that I found. Okay, Ictotherium. It's an extinct type of. Okay, Ictotherium. I found it's an extinct type of hyena. So Ictotherium is an extinct genus belonging to the family Hyenidae and the subfamily Ictotherinae. Ictotherium species were endemic to Eurasia, which includes Pakistan obviously, and Africa, which is exactly the range that we're talking about, during the middle Miocene through to the early Pliocene, and existed approximately 7.4 million years. Ictotherium were about 1.2 metres, which is exactly what Pachycetus was. They looked more like civets than modern hyenas, and civets are semi-aquatic, as we found out. They possessed a long body with short legs. Judging from the teeth, they were insectivores, and Ictotherium was a very successful and abundant genus. So Ictotherium was all over during the middle Miocene. So why are they not saying that it was just an Ictotherium? And let's have a wee look at the Ictotherium skeleton, and look, there you go. The Ictotherium skeleton is exactly that of Pachycetus. So that's what I'm saying Pachycetus was. I'm saying Pachycetus was an Ictotherium. But science isn't saying that. Science is saying that Pachycetus was definitely a whale, and it was definitely the ancestor of all whales and all dolphins. So let's go into more references now for Pachycetus. If you want to check on my references as well, I've put the front picture here, so when you go to Wikipedia references you can check that I haven't doctored any of this. So that's what the front page of that reference looks like. Okay, so what the reference is, where all this evidence comes from: the origin of whales and their transition from land to sea is one of the most interesting problems of mammalian evolution. So straight away they're admitting it's a problem to say that all mammals started on land and then made a transition into the sea, and they're saying it's a problem for them, for evolution, to explain that. They were found in association with a terrestrial mammalian fauna, which was exactly what the other reference was saying. They were found in association with lots of other mammal bones and lots of other terrestrial mammal bones, mammals that only lived on the land. 3 genera of primitive cetaceans are known from the Caldana Formation of Pakistan. Gandakaskia, Ictophilistes and Pachycetus are known only from teeth, were originally described as mesonychid. So basically all 3 versions of Pachycetus were originally described as mesonychids. The left auditory bulla is missing in one of the specimens, and that's basically the only part that they can say is anything like a whale or a dolphin, and it was missing in one of the specimens. The middle ear in Pakicetus, the fossae are absent or poorly developed in Protocetus as well, but a peribular sinus is conspicuously developed in later Archaeocetes and in other Cetaceans. Consequently, there is no evidence that Pakicetus could hear directionally underwater. So it's just the same as humans. Humans can't hear directionally underwater. They can hear bits and bobs, and they could probably tell where a general sound is coming from, but they don't have the same hearing that they do on land, and it is exactly the same with Pakicetus. There's no evidence it could hear directionally underwater, which is the whole premise of them saying that it is the ancestor of all whales and all dolphins. Interestingly, when it says here, these fossae are absent or poorly developed in Protocetus, Protocetus is an animal that is much further down the line, they say, from Pakicetus, is about 2 or 3 animals away from Pakicetus, more towards whales, and they're saying that that animal didn't even have the underwater hearing either. In terms of function, the auditory mechanism of Pakicetus appears more similar to that of land mammals than it is to any group of existing marine mammals. So Pakicetus's hearing is more similar to existing land mammals than it is to any existing marine mammal. The fauna associated with Pakicetus at Chorlakai is dominated by land mammals. Non-mammalian remains include poorly preserved planorbis-like snails, fishes, particularly catfish, turtles and crocodiles. All of these are found together in several closely spaced 10 to 40 centimetre beds of coarse calcareous granule stone within a 50 metre red shale sequence of the Lower Caldana Formation. So it's a composite skeleton that is been put together, scattered around with other mammal remains and non-mammal remains in a very, very small section of 10 to 40 centimetre beds. So all of these bones crunched all together in these very small beds, and they're picking these individual bones out and they're saying this is definitely a different type of animal here, and it's definitely a whale. Even although it can't hear in water, it's got 4 functional legs, and it's nothing like any whales. Altogether, this evidence indicates a fluvial and continental rather than marine environment for Pakicetus during at least part of its daily or annual life cycle at Chorlakai. It's basically saying it lived its life on the land. The dentition and cranial anatomy of Pakicetus indicate that it was well equipped to feed on fishes in the surface waters of shallow seas, but it lacked auditory adaptations necessary for a marine existence. We do not yet know anything about the postcranial anatomy of early Eocene whales. The fact that Pakicetus is preserved in fluvial red sediments in association with land mammals indicates that early Eocene whales may still have spent a significant amount of time on land. So there is no proof that Pakicetus is a whale. He's went through his whole study and basically said there is no evidence that Pakicetus is a whale, but at the end he's saying, well, whales were spending a lot of time on the land at that point, even though there's no evidence that Pakicetus was a whale. And this is the front page of the next reference. 3 genera of early Middle Eocene whales are known from Pakistan. Well, not really. There's 3 different types of Pakicetus that you combined into one skeleton. The early Cenozoic mammalian fauna of Pakistan and India is poorly known, so they're basically admitting that all the mammals from that region of the world at that particular time are poorly known. In this paper, we describe a new genus and species of Archaeocetacean Pakicetus inachus based on a partial cranium and dental remains found in the bone bed at Charlakai. So they're saying it's definitely an Archaeocete, which would be considered a type of whale or dolphin, an early whale or dolphin, and it's based on part of a skull. Some dental remains is enough to say that that is definitely a whale. I don't think that's very scientific. Discovery in 1978 and 1979 of the specimens described here indicate that Pt.2, also initially regarded as a mesonechid, is probably a cetacean as well. Now that's very, very ambiguous, so on the initial observation and study of this Ictholestes, they were just saying it was one of those mesonechids. And they're not even committal when they say it's a cetacean. They're saying, well, it's that one's probably a cetacean as well. No dental remains were found with the cranium, but upper and lower teeth from the same bed are the correct size to belong to it. So They didn't actually find the dental remains with the partial skull. They found it in the same bed and it correlates in size, so they're just saying, bang, that's it. They're definitely the same animal. In a following report, we described the first insectivores and bats from Chorlakai, which is interesting because, as I specified in my previous video, right, they're saying that all mammals evolved on the land. Bats are a version of flying mammals. They're the only mammals that can fly, and by the time of the Eocene, they were fully fledged flyers in the sky. So we have evidence of the bats from the Eocene 56 million years ago, and they were bats then. Bats were bats then, 56 million years ago. So if evolution is true, bats would have had a very, very long period of time evolving to become bats. But by this point, whales haven't even become whales yet, supposedly, and the only evidence that they've got that whales are becoming whales is a dog that's got an ear that's slightly like whales. So they don't actually have an explanation. The interesting thing is they don't actually have an explanation or any evidence whatsoever that bats evolved from land-dwelling mammals, which would have had to have been true at some point, because the model of evolution tells us that all mammals came from the land and then they went into the sea, and they don't mention it very much, but they also went into the sky supposedly. But bats were already fully fledged bats by then. The first suggestion that whales were present in early Middle Eocene mammalian faunas of Pakistan was the discovery of a fragmentary specimen of Candaschia previously regarded as a mesonechid. Well, that's not very conclusive. The new Cetacean specimens described here include a remarkably complete posterior portion of a cranium that demonstrates beyond question the presence of whales in the early Middle Eocene Kuldana Formation of Pakistan. So they're saying, as I said, from that point, from just finding a skull, a fragmentary skull and some teeth, which was originally observed in mesonechid, they're saying it is definitely a whale. Hyphenated early Middle Eocene in this paper to indicate that the age of the mammal-bearing bed in the Kuldana Formation at Charlakai may be either early or Middle Eocene. So bats have already evolved into bats by this point, but whales haven't evolved into whales. And there's no evidence that there is no fossil evidence whatsoever that bats came from the land into the sky. Sutures separating individual bones are not well preserved, making it difficult or impossible to estimate the relative size of most bones contributing to the brain case. Out of these fragmentary bones that they found and made a complete skeleton of, it was actually formed from individual bones that were not well preserved, and that made it difficult or impossible to estimate the size of the bones, but they just formed it into a brain case anyway. No postcranial remains can be referred to Pakicetus inachus at present. This specimen was previously interpreted as the mandible of a juvenile artiodactyl, so again, when it was just observed, they thought it was an ungulate. The mandibular bone of this is porous in texture, which is another indication that it represents a young individual. The specimen is the right size and morphology to belong to Pakicetus, and it is referred to Pakicetus atoke rather than Pakicetus inachus because it was found near the type locality. So, did you know that as you grow older, your bones change and some of them fuse into larger bones? So they're taking a bone from a young individual, what they know as a young individual, and they're just kind of squeezing it into another Pakicetus animal because it was near it. It's very, very flimsy, all of this evidence. So postcrania, just to let you know what postcrania is, in zoology and vertebrate paleontology refers to all or part of the skeleton apart from the skull, so it's everything other than the skull. Now listen to this. Frequently, fossil remains, e.g. of dinosaurs or other extinct tetrapods, consist of partial or isolated skeletal elements. These are referred to as postcrania. Sometimes there is disagreement over whether the skull and skeleton belong to the same or different animals. One example is the case of a crustaceous sauropod, Nemegtosaurus, found in association with the postcranial skeleton Opisthochilacudia. So, even in the science community of people who are long in the game are debating with each other about when you find bones, Do they belong to that animal? Do they belong to another animal? Is it the same animal? Is it two different animals? To be honest, the information that we can take from fossils or bone evidence is overstated. That's what I'm finding. It's very overstated how much we can actually tell from finding fossils and bones. The holotype Pachycetus anachus described here includes the best preserved basicranium of any protocetid known, so it's very galling to consider that this animal, the skull bones weren't of the same size, they made it together into a skull anyway, and now they're saying that that is the best preserved one out of any of the examples of these animals that they say went on to become all whales and all dolphins. In our present state of knowledge, the three genera are differentiated only on dental characteristics. The cranium is known only for Pachycetus, and no postcranial remains referable to any of these genera have yet been described. Ichthyolestes and Gandasket were both originally described as mesonicids. So again, it's just all very, very flimsy. That's the next reference that I went to if you want to check up on what I'm doing. All phylogenetic studies indicate that Pachycetids are more closely related to living cetaceans than to artiodactyls and mesonicians. Again, that's inaccurate, as we've already seen at the start. The phylogenetic study compared artiodactyl bones and cetacean bones together, and they said that cetaceans was like that group, even though that group doesn't exist in reality, in real life. Adaptations for life in water in Ambulocetus and later whales complicate determination of their closest relatives. So they're saying that some of these animals, because of the different adaptations that they've got, it's hard to say what group they're related to. There are three genera of Pachycetid cetaceans: Pachycetus, Nalacetus and Ichthyolestes. Pachycetus is the largest, followed by Nalacetus, approximately 5% smaller in linear dimensions, and Ichthyolestes, approximately 29% smaller. Until now, only teeth, jaws and one brain case have been described for Pachycetids. So of the three animals that they merged together to make the composite skeleton, one of them was 5% smaller and one of them was 30% smaller, and that is a big difference. That sounds to me like they've combined three different animals. Pachycetid form and function. Aquatic postcranial adaptations are pronounced in late Eocene basilosaurids and Dorodontids, the oldest obligate aquatic cetaceans for which the entire skeleton is known, and therefore can be used to evaluate Pachycetid morphology. Aquatic adaptations of basilosaurids and Dorodontids include presence of short neck vertebrae, thoracic and lumbar vertebrae that are similar in length, unfused sacral vertebrae, lack of a sacroiliac joint, presence of a short tail with a ball vertebra, a vertebra at the base of the fluke with convex articular surfaces, broad fan-shaped scapula with anterior acromion and small supraspinous fossa, an ulna with a large and transversely flat olecranon, a wrist and distal forearm flattened in the plane of the hand, and tiny hind limbs. Now get this, Pachycetus display none of these features, so what they're saying is that they do know the full skeletons for Basilosaurus and Dorodontids, and they are the ones that are closest in nature to cetaceans, and Pachycetus don't have any of the skeletal features that those animals have, and those animals were completely aquatic. Pachycetid neck vertebrae are longer than late Eocene whales, and the trunk vertebrae increase in size from anterior to posterior as in land mammals. So basically Pachycetus was a land mammal and there's no evidence to say otherwise. Motion in Pachycetids is restricted as a result of their revolute zygopophyses, a feature in common with stiff-backed runners such as mesonicans and many extinct and modern artiodactyls. The Pachycetid sacrum consists of four solidly fused vertebrae, and there is a strong sacroiliac joint as in land mammals and in amphibious whales such as Ambulocetus and Couchicetus, but unlike later cetaceans. So it's basically saying that it had features in common with stiffed back runners, so it did have legs, and they're saying it had adaptations for running fast, but some people are trying to say if it ran fast it would break its legs and things like that. But it was originally described as a mesonicid, and it's got all the fundamental abilities of a mesonicid. So why are we not saying it's a mesonicid? The pachycetid scapula has a large supraspinous fossa with a small acromion, unlike any other cetacean, so it's not a cetacean. The humerus is long and slender and all but lacks deltopectoral crest as in running mammals. So it's exactly like running mammals, and it's nothing like cetaceans is what they're describing there. Distally, the humerus has a wide, tightly articulating hinge joint for the radius and ulna, allowing a great degree of flexion but few other motions. This is unlike cetaceans but is common in running mammals, so again, it's like running mammals, it's nothing like cetaceans. The tibia is long in pachycetids and has a short tibial crest. Long tibiae are present in fast land mammals and also in phoquid seals. So it's got a long tibia that's, strangely enough, so now we're starting to find out that some animals have similar bones, but they can't actually do the same things. So what evolution is trying to tell you is we can look at this type of bone and we can tell that this animal could do this, this or that, and from that we can see that all animals had a common ancestor and this animal is the ancestor of all whales. But when we're actually looking into what they're saying, the detail of what they're saying that Pachycetus has got a long tibia and that fast land mammals have got that, but so have phoquid seals. And phoquid seals can't even function on land, so obviously that means that some animals have similar bones, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they can do similar things. The relative length of these bones in pachycetids, their slender appearance, the short tibial crest, high patellar groove and symmetrical knee make the phoquid mode of locomotion unlikely for pachycetids, so they can tell from looking at the bones more detailed that Pachycetus didn't use its bones like seals do, and their external morphology is more similar to that of running and jumping mammals, so they can tell that it was a good runner and a good jumper. Running features are also found in the ankle, where the proximal trochlea of the astragalus is constrained to a tight hinge joint like artiodactyls. So again, it's like ungulates, it's not like cetaceans. The calcaneum has a long tuber and an obliquely set narrow cuboid facet. These features are commonly interpreted as adaptations for running, although they are retained in non-running graviportal artiodactyls. Again, just to reiterate the point that some animals can have similar bones but they don't necessarily do the same thing. When they look at Pachycetus in context, they can tell that it had adaptations for running, but also the type of bones that Pachycetus had are also prevalent in non-running graviportal artiodactyls, and I think a graviportal artiodactyl is when, like a hippo, you stand about and you use your weight. So hippos can't run, rhinos can't really run, but they've got similar bones to Pachycetus. It doesn't mean that Pachycetus is the ancestor of all rhinos or the ancestor of all hippos, but it's supposedly Pachycetus is definitely a whale, even though we're finding out that it was actually completely on land. It could go into the water if it wanted to. It was a fast runner and it could jump, and most of the things that they're describing are saying that it was the only cetacean that had this. So the only cetacean that had these things is a long convoluted way of saying this wasn't a cetacean. But unlike late Eocene cetaceans and other marine mammals, sirenians and demostylians, that's like manatees and seals, the lacrimal foramen is present in pachycetids and other archaic cetaceans, but is usually absent in aquatic mammals. Basically, they're admitting there that some of the things that they are saying they're using to describe was an adaptation towards cetaceans isn't actually present in cetaceans. Unlike any other cetacean, the pachycetid outer ear was unspecialised and similar to that of land mammals. In the case of pachycetids, the absence of air sinuses insulating the ears, the firm fusion of the periotic to the surrounding bones, and the presence of a flat tympanic membrane suggest that reception of airborne sound is well developed but are inconsistent with good underwater hearing. It is most likely that the specialisations of the pachycetid middle ear are analogous to those of some subterranean mammals and are related to the reception of substrate bone vibrations or sound when the head is in contact with the ground. Turtles are in close contact with the substrate and gather sensory information using this method. So what they're saying is that even though Pachycetus had a auditory bulla, actually other animals have similar adaptations, but it's when they put their head close to the ground and they listen on the ground for movement. It makes them good at that, and turtles can do it. But they're not saying that turtles are the ancestors of all whales and all dolphins, and they're not saying that a turtle definitely is a whale, but they are saying that with Pachycetus, even though that's the only evidence that they have that it is similar to whales. Pachycetids were terrestrial mammals, no more amphibious than a tapir. Some tapirs are semi-aquatic and some of them aren't. Like, for example, a human isn't semi-aquatic, but it can go in the water because they're adventurous. Tapirs are actually not semi-aquatic mammals. A couple of them are, but they're actually not, and I think it's probably just they do go in the water from time to time, or they can go in the water, but they're not semi-aquatic. So that's the guy who studied the actual bones is saying that Pachycetids were no more amphibious than a tapir. A tapir is a large herbivorous mammal similar in shape to a pig with a short prehensile snout. Tapirs inhabit jungle and forest regions of South America, Central America and Southeastern Asia. Well, maybe Pachycetus was a tapir then. I was going to get into the phylogenetics thing to kind of debunk that quickly as well, because there's a difference between observational science and putting things through a computer model, and most of what is found in the evolution of whales is based on computer models, and computer models have been found in recent times to be inaccurate on many levels. So it was just to let you know that phylogenetics in biology is the study of the evolutionary history and relationships among individuals or groups of organisms. These relationships are discovered through phylogenetic inference methods that evaluate observed heritable traits such as DNA sequences or morphology under a model of evolution of these traits. Okay, so if you click on phylogenetic inference as highlighted there, it'll take you to computational phylogenetics, and when they say evaluate observed heritable traits, it's not observed heritable traits, it's just the DNA sequence. That's all it really is. And the morphology, which isn't observed science in the traditional sense, that's just them putting DNA sequences into a computer model. Computational phylogenetics is the application of computational algorithms, methods and programs to phylogenetic analysis. The goal is to assemble a phylogenetic tree representing a hypothesis about the evolutionary ancestry of a set of genes, species or other taxa. So we're relying on computers to give us information about the human and animal world, but humans are fallible, so if they have programmed a computer from the start on a false premise, then it's going to come up with results based from a false premise in the first place. So that's all I'm trying to say, and I'll show you a couple of examples of other computer studies going wrong. So they're admitting now that the climate models are wrong. Our climate models are wrong. Global warming has slowed and recent changes are down to natural variability. Climate computer models are proven wrong. Global warming hysteria is based on climate computer models that don't work. If outgoing radiation from the atmosphere is reduced to less than the incoming radiation from the sun, heat energy will accumulate in the climate system, causing rising temperatures. The models assume that CO2 emissions will cause water vapour, which is the strongest greenhouse gas, to increase in the upper atmosphere, trapping the radiation in our atmosphere. They also assume clouds will trap more radiation, but satellite and weather balloon data, actual observed data, shows the opposite of the climate model predictions. So that's the example of the climate model. The software has been programmed with a false premise, and so it'll always come up with false results because it's been programmed with a false premise. Right, okay. All of these lines in the red and the one line in the green is showing you the outgoing radiation. So the green line in the middle of the chart shows the Earth Radiation Budget Experiment satellite observed data, and it shows that more outgoing radiation escapes to space as temperatures rise, rather being trapped as the UN computer models believe. CO2 emissions do not trap much heat and do not cause significant global warming. So the observed satellite data shows that radiation isn't getting trapped in our atmosphere, it's going out into space, but all of the computer models have been programmed with this false premise that water vapour and clouds and CO2 emissions do trap radiation in our atmosphere, and so all of their data is showing all of those red examples of the heat not escaping our atmosphere, but the actual observed satellite data shows that heat is readily escaping our atmosphere. Again, there's a computer model on the left there, and it's got a very red centre, and it shows that the models predict a distinctive pattern of warming, a hot spot of enhanced warming in the upper troposphere over the tropics, shown as the large red spot in the diagram below. Radiosonde data from weather balloons show no such hotspot pattern. That's the one on the right. If it was there, we would have easily detected it. The predicted hotspot on the computer model on the left is entirely absent from the observational record. This shows that most of the global temperature change cannot be attributed to increasing CO2 concentrations. The models fail because they assume both water vapour and clouds strongly increase the CO2 induced temperature changes, whereas recent research shows both water vapour and clouds greatly reduce temperature changes. So the computer models have been programmed with a false premise to begin with, and they therefore show false results. And I'm not saying that that's what phylogenetics does, but I'm saying that from what we've seen so far, the observed evidence of just looking at the bones, scientists were saying, well, Pt.2 was a Mesonicid, but it was only after they started using the phylogenetic studies in the computer models that they said, oh, this is like all whales. But it wasn't really like all whales, as we also discovered it was a combination of whale bones and artiodactyl bones that they used in their sample. And they're saying that all cetaceans were like that sample. Well, duh, because it had cetacean bones in the sample. Again, this is computer models. Hurricanes are forecast using computer models. The accuracy of hurricane forecast models can vary significantly from storm to storm. For some storms, the factors affecting the hurricane track are relatively straightforward, and the models are not only accurate, but they produce similar forecasts. While for other storms, the factors affecting the hurricane track are more complex, and different models produce very different forecasts. So all I'm explaining here is that computer models aren't as reliable as we like to think they are. There's another article here saying that we don't understand cumulus clouds, at least not everything about them. There are major questions about the dynamics of the clouds. For example, this is particularly true for the convective updrafts, the vertical air motions that generate the classical cauliflower shapes of the clouds and control most of the physical processes such as the formation of precipitation. This lack of knowledge means that the dynamics cannot be represented correctly in weather and climate models. Weather forecasting models struggle to correctly represent the timing of convection and the amount of rainfall. Climate models disagree in the prediction of future changes in tropical rainfall because each model represents convective updrafts in different ways. So the aim of this PhD project is to improve the understanding of updrafts and convective clouds, and hence provide a better physical description of these clouds and weather and climate models. So again, that just goes to show that a computer model is only as good as how it has been programmed, and what that guy is saying is that actual modern science doesn't generally understand convective updrafts and clouds, so we can't understand fundamental aspects of clouds and what they do. It's hard for these very, very complex computers to predict what's going to happen. Recent storms highlight flaws in the top US weather model. The US, which pioneered the groundbreaking science of weather forecasting using mathematical simulations of the atmosphere, has fallen behind other nations when it comes to the accuracy of its global forecasting model. The emerging modelling gap could erode the accuracy of US weather forecasts and also cause greater economic losses from weather events. So the current weather hurricane prediction model that the US are using, even although they were one of the leading countries before, they've actually fell behind when they adapted their new model. So it's just another indication that computer models are not as reliable. So let's go on to Ambulocetus now. That's a picture of the reconstructed Ambulocetus skeleton. This is some pictures of what artists have shown Ambulocetus could be like. It ranges quite wildly. And again, here is the actual skeletal evidence for Ambulocetus there. So what I'm finding when I'm looking through these things is that the diagrams are accurate and the diagrams look nice, but the actual bones, they look very ambiguous. It would be hard to tell scientifically, in my opinion, what those bones really were. If you go to the Ambulocetus Wikipedia page, right, excluding headings, the actual Wikipedia page is only 333 words. So what an encyclopedia is, it's a gathering of all, it's an attempt to gather all of man's knowledge and put it into bite-sized chunks, but it is one of man's most, any form of encyclopedia is one of man's most expansive works that man has ever created, an attempt to explain basically everything that man knows about. And when you go to Ambulocetus, which is one of the so-called ancestors of all whales, it's only explained in 333 words. If I was a primary school teacher and I gave a lesson to 7-year-olds, a bunch of say 6 or 7-year-olds, and I told them to write a story about what they did in the park yesterday, I would expect them to be able to produce 333 words. But we're not talking about what children done in the park yesterday, we're talking about the ancestor of all whales and all dolphins, and them saying that this is definitely the case. So this is some of the references from Ambulocetus. Early cetaceans, Pakicetus, Ambulocetus and Remington Ocetidae, all retain a number of primitive characteristics that they share with mesonicans. These include large hind limbs, scarlet with multiple fused vertebrae and poorly developed aquatic auditory systems. DeWesson 1996 indicate that Ambulocetus gives rise to the Protocetus, with the position of Remington somewhat uncertain. So this is them trying to give the sequential order of what animals came before whales, but one of the most important ones, Remington Ocetidae, they don't know actually where it goes in the timeline. Ambulocetus cannot be supported as the direct ancestor of later cetaceans using the data in this analysis. So what you'll find at the textbook level, they'll say this is all above board, this is all scientific, this is all there, but when you go to see what actual scientists are saying when they're looking at information, you'll see things like this. The Ambulocetus cannot be supported as the direct ancestor of any cetaceans. The position of Remington Ocetidae is somewhat uncertain. This view is consistent with the phylogenetic tree shown here, as long as both Remington Ocetidae and Protocetidae are derived from the common ancestor with Ambulocetidae. So what they're saying is that they believe that Ambulocetus, Cucucetus, that's Remington Ocetidae, and Protocetus all have a common ancestor. They don't know what that common ancestor is, but as long as that common ancestor remains the same, then the phylogenetic tree is correct. But if new information comes to light and the phylogenetic tree is not correct, the arrangement of these families shown here is consistent with the morphological data and only weakly preferred by the stratigraphic data, because many of these taxa are poorly known. More morphologic data could easily affect this portion of the tree. So Cucucetus, Protocetus and Ambulocetus are poorly known taxa in general, he's saying. And if they find out more data, they could easily find out that they're nothing to do with this part of the phylogenetic tree. It is not clear which protocetid is most closely related to Basilosaurus. So the protocetids are the animals that were directly before the Basilosauruses if you read the textbooks, but this guy is saying they don't actually know which protocetus is most like Basilosaurus. The forelimbs of basilosaurid archaeocetes are intermediate in form between the forelimbs of mesonicids and those of modern cetaceans. So this guy seems to still be working on the premise that mesonicids are related to the cetacean line, but I've shown you at the start of this video that that's not what science is currently saying. They're saying that mesonicids aren't anything to do with whales, but he's still working on the premise that they are. The scapula has a long acromion process which is orientated anteriorly, as is the coracoid process. This feature has been cited as a shared derived feature of cetaceans in general, but the orientation of the acromion and coracoid processes is not known from any earlier cetaceans. So what he's saying there is that all of these animals share the acromion and coracoid, but the orientation of those bones isn't known in any of the animals that they're talking about. That seems to be what he's saying there, which is very galling for evolution theory. The radius articulates with the ulna along a flat surface. This feature and the fact that the radius and ulna articulate with a common trochlea on the humerus indicate that the basilosaurids, like Ambulocetus, were incapable of pronation and supination at the elbow. Okay, so what is pronation? Pronation refers to the inward rolling of the foot during normal motion and occurs as the outer edge of the heel strikes the ground and the foot rolls inward and flattens out. A moderate amount of pronation is required for the foot to function properly. What is supination? Supination, the opposite of pronation, refers to the outward roll of the foot during normal motion. A natural amount of supination occurs during the push-off phase of the running gait as the heel lifts off the ground and the forefoot and toes are used to propel the body forward. So if you couldn't pronate and you couldn't supinate, then you couldn't support your body on land and you couldn't walk on land. Okay, so let's go back to the textbook Ambulocetus then. Ambulocetus was an early cetacean that could walk as well as swim. Along with other members of Ambulocetus, it is a transitional fossil that shows how whales evolved from land-living mammals. It is also named the walking whale because of this. So it couldn't pronate and it couldn't supinate, so actually it couldn't walk on land. It definitely could not walk on land, according to the Wikipedia reference, but at the textbook level they're saying, oh, this is the walking whale. Well, it couldn't walk at all. It couldn't support itself on the land. Ambulocetus swam by undulating the vertebral column dorsoventrally, as in modern cetaceans, while propelling the body with the hind limbs and manoeuvring with the forelimbs on land. However, their locomotion was probably awkward and somewhat like that of seals. So seals can come out and go on the land. They can support themselves, but they are not walkers. They can't walk. Their movement on land is very limited. The skull of Ambulocetus had a long rostrum with laterally facing orbits elevated above the level of the snout and brain case. Unlike cetaceans, in extant vertebrates, elevated orbits are sometimes an adoption for stalking terrestrial prey while remaining submerged. Ambulocetus has been interpreted as an amphibious ambush predator analogous to crocodiles. As noted above, Pakicetus has been found only in freshwater deposits, whereas Ambulocetus occurs in near-shore marine beds. Apparently that's one of the problems with Ambulocetus, is because its eyes are high up on its head like crocodiles, and mammals don't have that, so that's a bit of a misnomer. I'm going with the fact that it's a seal. If it couldn't walk on land, as it said it couldn't pronate or supinate, there is the actual bones again of Ambulocetus, so I think it could be a crocodile, especially if its eyes were high up on its head, but I'm just going to go with the fact that it was a seal. I'm going to say it was a seal. And even though they're saying, oh well, seals weren't around at that time, that's not what I'm saying. I don't think that there maybe was any particular time period for any animal. I think it's just a type of seal, and if you look there, the skeletons are basically exactly the same, except from Ambulocetus has got a longer tail. I just want to talk about the bones and how, when you look in history, animals were the same, but they actually at times did have different bones, and animals were actually much larger in history as well. Castorides, it was a giant beaver. There's examples of giant everything. Anything that you look into the past, there's basically a giant version of it. Castoroids, or giant beaver, is an extinct genus of enormous beavers that lived in North America during the Pleistocene, and its northern sister species was the largest beaver to ever exist. Castoroids, also known as giant beavers, were much larger than modern beavers. Their average length was approximately 2 meters or 6 foot, and they could grow as large as 2.2 meters or 7 foot. The weight of the giant beaver could vary from 90 kilograms to 125 kilograms. This makes it the largest known rodent in North America during the Pleistocene and the largest known beaver. The hind feet of the giant beaver were much larger than in modern beavers, while the hind legs were shorter. The tail was longer but may have been narrower. However, because soft tissues decay, it is not known whether its tail resembled the tails in modern beavers, and it can only be assumed that its feet were webbed like in modern species. The skull structure of the giant beaver shows that it is presumably participated in extended underwater activity thanks to the ability to take in more oxygen into its lungs. So giant beavers had different hind legs. Their hind legs were shorter, their tail was longer, so they had a different actual bone structure than the beavers that we have now, but they were still beavers. So what I'm saying is that could very well just be a seal. It might have a slightly different bone structure, for example a longer tail, but there is no important difference between the animal at the top and the animal at the bottom, and they're saying from the evidence of actual observation of the bones, they're saying that it couldn't walk on land, even although it was called the walking whale coincidentally. But if you look, there is no important difference between the seal at the top and Ambulocetus at the bottom there. The only difference is it has a longer tail. But I'm just showing you now through the giant beaver, and every other animal has a giant version of itself. They're saying that it actually had different bones and it grew a bit differently. One of the defining characteristics of the giant beaver were their incisors, which differ in size and shape than those of modern beavers. Modern beavers have chisel-like incisor teeth for gnawing on wood, while the teeth of the giant beaver were bigger and broader and grew to about 6 inches long. These incisors were not as efficient at cutting wood, therefore it is possible that the giant beaver did not construct dams, so it maybe even possibly had different behaviour as well. Right, this is Cuchicitus, that's the reconstructed skeleton of Cuchicitus. That's the Remingtonocytidae that they said. There is the actual bones. Again, it's different to what the textbook version of it is. Oh, this is definitely this type of animal and definitely that type of animal. But when you look at the bones, it's very ambiguous and very underwhelming. There's a diagram of the bones which seems much clearer again. And there's the actual bones, not very clear. This is some representations of Cuchicitus. There's some more representation of Cuchicitus, what they think it could have been. This is the references that Wikipedia used to get their information. Our recent paleontological fieldwork in the Middle Eocene Harude Formation of Cache has yielded a partial skeleton of a new species of Eocene cetaceans, here named Cuchicitus minimus. The new species represents a new genus. The skeleton includes teeth, skull fragments, limb bones, and a relatively complete vertebral column. The Middle Eocene Harude Formation is well known for its wealth of early Cetacean fossils, that's in dispute, including 6 genera in the families Remingtonocytidae, Protocytidae and Dorodontidae. These cetaceans ranged across a wide spectrum of body shapes and locomotor modes, so they didn't even move in the same way, but they're saying that they're definitely the ancestors of all whales and dolphins. For instance, Remingtonocytus was a powerful cetacean with powerful limb skeleton that was probably the main propulsive organ. Babeocetus and Indocetus are protocetids for which no skeletons are available but are closely related forms such as Georgiacetus. So they're having the gall to say that Remingtonocytes were definitely ancestors of the lineage of whales, but 2 of the examples that they use, they don't even have a skeleton for them. Babeocetus and Indocetus, they don't actually have skeletons for them, but they're saying that they're definitely part of the lineage of whales. The tibia shows that the medial condyle was concave and set more distally than the lateral condyle, as commonly seen in some seals and sea lions. So the bones that they have are similar to seals and sea lions. The vertebral column of Cuchicitus is more complete than that of any other described early Middle Eocene cetacean. Here we study the functional morphology of the vertebral column using the proportions of the centra of the vertebrae in a plot that follows the style of Buchholz. 3 conclusions can be drawn. As figure 4 shows, there are no pronounced breaks in the height-width proportions of the preserved caudal vertebrae. Abrupt changes in these proportions occur in mammals with well-defined flukes, such as manatees. Buchholz used these proportions to infer that a tail fluke was not the main propulsive organ in the Eocene cetacean Rhodhocetus. Similarly, we argue that there is no evidence that Cuchicitus has a well-defined tail fluke, although it is possible that it had a flat tail like the manatees. So they're saying that, so far they're saying that the bones are like sea lions and seals, and the bones are like manatees, but they don't have a tail fluke, which is a universal trait for all whales and dolphins. The very wide lumbar and proximal caudal vertebrae are consistent with a stockily built body of Cuchicitus, possibly not unlike a manatee. So again, compared to a manatee, it's got bones like a manatee, not a cetacean. Thirdly, and most importantly, in Cuchicitus, the pattern of change in vertebral lengths is unique among cetaceans, so it's probably not a cetacean then if it's the only cetacean that's not got it, and it's not even a cetacean. Two areas of the vertebral column show local maxima of vertebral length. The first maximum occurs in the lumbar column and the second in the caudal column. This pattern differs from that in all known modern and Eocene cetaceans, but is similar to the length pattern of otters. So now its bones are being compared to an otter, but still not being compared to a whale, even although it's one of the ancestors of all whales and all dolphins. Butchokes interpreted this pattern as indicating a specialised mode of locomotion, where maxima in the length of the lumbar and caudal column indicate that two different maxima of exertion, called undulatory maxima, occur in the vertebral column as the animal is moving. These were also found to occur in non-mammals such as the gavial. None of the Eocene cetaceans studied by Butchokes show this pattern, so it's not even like the other animals that they say are the ancestors of all whales and dolphins. Bimodal undulatory locomotion may not have occurred in any fossil cetaceans for which the vertebral column has been described. So the way in which cetaceans move, this guy's saying that possibly all of the animals that they have identified as being the ancestors of whales and dolphins don't actually move in the same way that whales and dolphins do. The vertebral column of Cuchicites provides independent evidence for this hypothesis and suggests that ambulocetids and remingtonocetids swam using a transitional mode of locomotion that is not used by any other known fossil cetacean. So they don't have bones like whales and dolphins, they don't move like whales and dolphins, but for some reason they're definitely the ancestors of whales and dolphins. This stands in stark contrast with the limited information about the skull and dentition of Cuchicites, so you don't know anything about the skull or its teeth. Right, okay, so I'm about to show you two different scientists disagreeing with each other here on Cuchicites. The narrow snout, the elongate premolars and four vertebrae sacrum indicate that Cuchicites is a remingtonocetid. It can be diagnosed from other remingtonocetids on the basis of its small size. It is less than half the size and linear dimensions of the smallest known remingtonocetid and may be the smallest Eocene cetacean in the world. This is from another reference. Bajpai and Thewesson wrote that Cuchicites minimus can be diagnosed from other remingtonocetids on the basis of its small size and claimed that it is less than half the size and linear dimensions of the smallest known remingtonocetid, without presenting any quantitative comparison that might provide a basis or explanation of the rationale for this claim. Lumbar centrum lengths of 38 to 40 millimeters for Cuchicites are only about 20 to 25% smaller than comparable dimensions for medium-sized remingtonocetids. So that's two scientists disagreeing on even the size of the actual bones, and they're disagreeing by wide margins. You don't have to be a scientist to know what size a bone is, but they're managing to disagree about it. We have not yet been able to identify the accompanying two cranial fragments as to the position in the cranium. So they've got two cranial fragments and they don't actually know where they go in the skull, which is similar to what they were saying in the past with Pachyceus, that all the skull bones were of different sizes but they kind of forged them together anyway. With the Cuchicites, what they did was they actually combined two completely different fossils and just said that it was one animal. This is the jawbone for the one Cuchicites that they found. That's the jawbone, and they kind of extrapolated it and put it onto this skeleton. But the teeth, as you see, that is all they found. So they took this skeleton and from a completely different animal they gave it that jawbone, right? So similar to Remingtonocetidus harudensis, but differs in detail of molar morphology. M1 and M2 have second apical cusps following the first, which are not seen in LUVP, the holotype of harudensis. M2 is notably more massive. Its anterior crest in front of the apical cusp, and especially the posterior crest behind the apical cusp, are expanded and convex upward, while they are straight and concave respectively in R. harudensis. So they're basically saying that the teeth are completely different in these two different specimens, but they've forged them together anyway. Now there's some admission about this. It is difficult to compare Remingtonosides domandensis in detail to R. harduensis. The type of the latter, LUVP11037, is a fragmentary skull with roots for P4 and M3, left and right mandibular rami with roots for P4 and M3, much of the crown of an upper molar, isolated cusps of upper teeth and crowns of left M1 and M2. So they're saying it's difficult to compare the skull for harduensis, which is what they found, to the dentistry that they did find for the original skeleton part, and that's admission of that there. So they've basically got this, plonked it onto that, and there's really no comparison. They are completely separate species. At the textbook level though, they've kept them together as one species, and they're saying this is Cutucetus, this is what Cutucetus looks like, but in the actual scientific world they are completely separate things, and you're going to get an explanation of this here. Okay, so the Eocene Cetacean genera Androciphysis and Cutucetus are systematically revised, their anatomy described, and their phylogenetic position analysed. Each genus contains a single species. A. sloani and K. minimus are both known only from the Middle Eocene of the Indian subcontinent. Androciphysis and Cutucetus differ in a number of respects, the most important dental difference being that P2, P3, P2 and P3 are double-rooted in Androciphysis and single-rooted in Cutucetus. Lower molars are separated by diastementa in Cutucetus but not in Androciphysis. Postcranially, Androciphyus has caudal vertebrae that are far more robust than that of Cutucetus. We propose that the new clade Androcephali for these two genera. So they're saying two genera means two completely separate species. They're saying that they only know a single species for each one, but at the textbook level, okay, so the scientific world is admitting these are two completely different species, but at the textbook level they're saying they're still together and they're still one animal. That's the kind of dishonesty that we're getting. Now, this is Protocetus, the next animal. That's the reconstructed skeleton, and that's all the pictures I could really find about that. I don't know if they've found much else of Protocetus. That's the actual bones that they found, and that's the reconstructed skull. That's what they're saying Protocetus probably looked like in real life, and that one is very weird. And they're saying that's a possible rendition of it as well. Okay, so parts of the cranium, lower jaws and cervical vertebrae were found on the slope below the rest of the specimen. So that's actually a major no-no in the paleontology world, because if something is buried below something, it means it's from a completely different era using the geological column. I'm being a bit dishonest because as a non-evolutionist, I could go into stuff about the geological column with you and I could show you why it's not what they say it is, but I'm being a bit dishonest because they do say that the geological column is solid science, but I would say that it's not. I'll maybe go through that another time, but however, in the geological column, if something is buried way below something, it means it's from a completely different time period. And what they're saying with Protocetus is that parts of the cranium, lower jaws and cervical vertebrae were found on the slope below the rest of the specimen. That is a no-no in archaeology. But the posterior part of the brain case acts as articulated thoracic, lumbar, sacral and caudal vertebrae, ribs and innominate were excavated in place. Several large segments of the axial skeleton were removed in plaster. Articulated vertebrae of the type specimen were found coiled in a C-shape, presumably due to post-mortem contraction of the cerebrospinous ligament and dorsal epaxial back musculature. This is reminiscent of preservation of Dorodon skeletons in Egypt. The paratype is well preserved cranium and associated vertebrae found, so maybe it's just a Dorodon then. The external nares open relatively far anteriorly above C1. The frontal shield is relatively broad and the nuchal crest is unusually large for a protocetid, so they don't have much evidence of this animal, but of the information that they do have, the bones that they do have, they're saying it's not like a Protocetus at all. Auditory bullae were found with both specimens. These are relatively small for a Protocetus with such a large skull. So first of all, they're saying it's got a large skull for a Protocetus. Then they're saying not only has it got a large skull for a Protocetus, but its auditory bullae are small. especially considering it's got a large skull. I don't know if they really know what's going on, to be honest. The axis C2 is represented by a part of the neural arch only. This is robust and is distinctive in having a relatively short, blunt neural spine with a broad, flat surface for insertion of the nuchal ligament rather than the long and more pointed spine often seen in protocetids. So again, they've got very little bones for this animal. The major descriptive parts that they're telling us about it is that it's not like protocetids at all. Ribs, many partial ribs and pieces of ribs were collected with the holotype, and none can be identified to position precisely. It is easy to speculate about the locomotor and other adaptations of Archaeocetes for life in water, but such speculation has little basis without evidence provided by associated and preferably articulated skeletons, which we don't have until Basilosaurus and Dorodon. None of the ones before that have an articulated skeleton. The most complete articulated skeleton of a protocetus described to date is that of Rhodhocetus casrani. Rhodhocetus is relatively advanced evolutionary in having a sacrum lacking fusion of successive centra, but is primitive in retaining pleuropophyses connecting all sacrovertebrae. Protocetus described here from the late Lutetian is almost identical in skeletal completeness, but contrasts in retaining some sacral fusion while losing all special connections between other sacrovertebrae. Each is differently specialised, and it is not clear which is more likely to be on the main line of later whale evolution. Both are important in documenting the length and form of much of a vertebral column, but neither is complete, and there is a limit as to what we can say about their locomotion. So this one's being quite honest in their saying we can't actually tell from what we've got how this animal moved. They're also saying that they don't know where it would come in the line of whale evolution. So again, it's just a long sequential line of very, very flimsy information. But at the textbook level, they're telling you that this is all solid. One approach to interpretation of protocetids involves construction of diagrams of skeletal proportion comparing skull, vertebral and limb lengths and proportions, scaled to facilitate comparison of elements within the same skeleton and comparison of skeletal proportions across taxa. Existing whales and fully aquatic Basilosaurus have very different vertebral profiles from those of land mammals when compared in such diagrams. Here we introduce an innovation, which is addition of neural arch and neural spine heights for vertebrae to give a more complete picture of skeletal proportions. The skeleton of Protocetus is compared to that of Rhodhocetus. The former has a body weight estimated at about 620 kilograms, while the latter is slightly smaller with a body weight of about 590. Both have shorter cervicals than are typically found in land mammals, but longer cervicals than are found in later whales. So they're not like whales. Both have anterior thoracic centra that increase slightly in size, with neural spines that increase distinctly in length over the shoulder girdle. This appears as an arch in a diagram of skeletal proportion. Both have a second such arch in the vertebral column in the lumbosacral region. Protocetus has anterior caudal vertebrae that lengthen posteriorly, while Rhodhocetus has anterior caudal vertebrae that shorten posteriorly. Sounds completely opposite. Generalised land mammals, existing whales for example, have skeletal proportions including similarly separate anterior thoracic and lumbosacral arches and neural spine height. These might be interpreted as skeletal indicators of terrestrial locomotion, so sounds like they're actually saying that both Protocetus and Rhodhocetus have indicators that would show it was a land mammal, but any such interpretation is probably premature until limbs are known for both genera. So they don't have much of this animal, but they're saying it's for some reason at the textbook level, despite all of this ambiguous information at the textbook level, they're saying it's definitely very close to whales and dolphins. The configuration of sacral vertebrae is so different in different genera across the suborder Archaeoceti and so important for understanding hind limb reduction in early whale evolution that a system is required to encode it. So he's saying that the bones that they're finding across what they term as Archaeoceti are so different that they would probably need to set up a system to even start dissecting it and going through it in detail. Much remains to be learned about Lutetian whale evolution and discovery that the Habib Raha Damanda formations of Pakistan are richly fossiliferous opens a unique opportunity for studying this, but more importantly he's saying much remains to be learned about whale evolution. And this is Pt.2, which is I think the fourth animal down the line towards whales from Pt.2, and even at that point they're saying we don't know much about it and we need to actually develop a system to encode how different these animals actually are. This is the next one. This is Dorodon, and now we're getting into an animal that they do have the complete skeleton for, right? So in this case, the structure of the vertebral column, the nature of the elbow and wrist joints along with the size and form of the hind limbs suggest that Dorodon was incapable of supporting itself on land, so it was fully aquatic. Dorodon is unusual among mammals in that it replaces both upper and lower first premolars, so mammals generally don't replace their teeth, but some do, so it might not even be a mammal. It is unclear what structure present in Dorodon, if any, is homologous with the anterior palatine foramina in other mammals. Numerous small foramina are present on the palatal presentation of the premaxilla near the midline of the skull. These foramina are variable in number and size from side to side and from individual to individual. So all mammals have a hole that connects their nose to their mouth, and that's what they're saying. The palatine foramen is just a hole, and what they're saying is that in Dorodon there isn't one. And they're small and they're all over the place, and not only that, but it varies from individual to individual where the foramen, where the holes in the mouth are. This genus and the structure of the skeleton so far as known does not throw any new light upon the relationship of the zeuglodonts to the creodonts on the one hand, or to the odontoceti on the other, and its chief interest consists in its almost exactly intermediate position between Protocetus and Zeuglodon, both in structure and time. So Dorodon's considered to just be a basilosaurus basically, and that is the zeuglodonts. The creodonts is the mesonychids, dog type animals that lived on land, and the odontoceti is the whales and the dolphins. So what he's saying is that this animal doesn't throw any light at all on the relationship between Basilosaurus and mesonychids, or Basilosaurus and whales and dolphins. Okay, originally as well, when they looked at Dorodon, they just thought it was a juvenile, a young Basilosaurus, but other scientists have came along now and they're saying no, Dorodon is a completely separate species to Basilosaurus. But they were having a discussion about it, and someone said it cannot be indicative of a mere young age of the animal, as the form of the lower jaw is altogether different in the two animals, Zeuglodon having a continuous fissure connecting the alveoli and other groove along the edge of the jawbone, which are wanting in Dorodon. Besides, the posterior branch of the jaw is also different, the two lamellae of the bone rising to the same height and much higher in Zeuglodon than in Dorodon, which has a deep depression upon its external surface owing to the difference in the height of the two laminae. Again, Zeuglodon has deep pits upon the external surface of the lower jaw, showing that the teeth or the upper jaw left an impression on the lower, resting upon it, as in the crocodiles of our day when the mouth is shut. So he's saying that he thinks this Dorodon is like a crocodile. And this is me showing you the mammals that do replace their teeth. A polyphoidont is any animal whose teeth are continuously replaced. In contrast, diphoidonts are characterised by having only two successive sets of teeth. Polyphoidonts include most toothed fishes, many reptiles such as crocodiles, geckos, and most other vertebrates. So one of the guys was saying that Dorodon was like a crocodile when it closed its mouth, and it does replace some of its teeth, and crocodiles are polyphoidonts. New permanent teeth grow in the jaws, usually under or just behind the old tooth from stem cells. Young animals typically have a full set of teeth when they hatch. There is no teeth change in the egg. Crocodiles are the only non-mammalian vertebrates with teeth sockets. Right. Evolution in mammals. Kangaroos, elephants and manatees are unusual among mammals because they are polyphyodonts, in contrast to most other mammals which replace their teeth only once in their lives. Although most existing mammals are non-polyphyodont, mammalian ancestors were during the evolution of the Arapsida. So again, evolution would like us to think that there's a uniformity in bones and what animals can do, their body structures, but we're finding that not really. One of the people who studied Ambulocetus bones is saying when it closes its mouth, the teeth overlap like a crocodile, and crocodiles are polyploidant, and so were Dorodon. But we're also finding that, well, even although mammals generally don't replace their teeth, some of them do. Kangaroos, elephants and manatees do, and interestingly enough, some of the past animals in this previous selection were also compared to manatees. There's a manatee skeleton there. Interestingly enough, manatees actually have this, what they call the vestigial bones of hind limbs, but it's not really, it's bones which anchor the genitalia and support the genitalia. Without these these animals wouldn't be able to have sex. So there's what a manatee skeleton looks like. That is it in real life. Now, manatees do have the thick bones. I don't think Dorodon's got that, but there's Dorodon there. I mean, it's, in terms of the skeleton, apart from the thick ribs, it is basically perfect to a manatee. Even these bones here, the manatee bones have got everything. And as I say, I showed you in the past that animals grew differently. They were the same animals, but they grew a bit differently, so there's no reason to say that this isn't a manatee that just had slightly less thick ribs. It's exactly the same as Dorodon. Another thing is that a lot of these animals have got these type of teeth. Now, you would think that even though that animal looks scary, the Dorodon, it does look scary, having those type of teeth, right, is actually for eating krill. So that's all. It wasn't a scary animal. This is the skull of a crab-eater seal. So what these teeth are for is for eating shell animals with shells. So a crab-eater seal has got those types, and so did Dorodon. And you would think that, whoa, look at that skull there. Whoa, that was a really fearsome animal. But in reality, that is what a crab-eater seal looks like. Very cute and very cuddly. So let me tell you, a lot of these animals look very fearsome, but let me show you. Okay, for example, look at this, right? Now that looks like quite a fearsome animal. What type of animal do you think that is? Whoa, scary animal. It's an aardvark, right? Not scary at all, only eats insects. But its bone structure looks scary. Now, whoa, what type of animal is that? That could probably eat you alive. What type of animal do you think that is? It's a badger. Not scary at all. So what I'm talking about, the artist impression and things like that, they're making it look as if, look at these amazing hunting animals, and to be honest, we don't know anything about them. Whoa, what do you think that wee scary animal is? You could probably bite your head off, that wee animal. It's a koala bear, the cutest animal in the animal world. But its skeleton looks scary, and so does the skeleton of Ambulocetus look scary, but it's got exactly the same bone structure as a manatee, and it might have just have been a manatee. Now let's go on to Basilosaurus. We're getting towards the end, so thanks for staying with me. That's the skeleton of Basilosaurus, looks exactly the same as Dorodon. That's what they're saying, an artist impression of Basilosaurus there. There's other impressions of Basilosaurus. The head of Basilosaurus did not have room for a melon like modern toothed whales, and the brain was smaller in comparison as well. They are not believed to have had the social capabilities of modern whales, so they didn't have fundamental aspects of what whales are and what they can do and how they survive. Falke 2011 concluded that the skull of Basilosaurus is asymmetrical like in modern toothed whales, and not as previously assumed symmetrical like in baleen whales and artiodactyls closely related to cetaceans. In modern toothed whales, this asymmetry is associated with high-frequency sound production and echolocation, neither of which is thought to be present in Basilosaurus. So Basilosaurus couldn't produce high-frequency sound and it couldn't echolocate, so it didn't have a melon, it couldn't echolocate, it wasn't anything like a whale. The ear of Basilosaurus is more derived than those in earlier archaeocetids such as Remingtonocetids and Protocetids, and the acoustic isolation provided by the air-filled sinuses inserted between the ear and the skull. The Basilosaurus ear did, however, have a large external auditory meatus, strongly reduced in modern cetaceans, but though this was probably functional, it can have been of little use underwater. Even though they're saying that the Cucucetus and Protocetus probably had a more developed hearing system for underwater than Basilosaurus did, and the way that Basilosaurus heard is not present in Cetaceans, so it wasn't a Cetacean then. It wasn't the ancestor of Cetaceans. Basilosaurus move in an angular-form, eel-like body shape because of the elongation of the centre of the thoracic through anterior caudal vertebrae. In life, these vertebrae were filled with marrow, and because of the enlarged size, made them buoyant. From this, it can be deduced that Basilosaurus swam predominantly in 2 dimensions at the sea surface, in contrast to Dorodon, which was probably a diving 3-dimensional swimmer. So Dorodon could dive to the depths of the ocean, but Basilosaurus couldn't. Basilosaurus couldn't even swim in the deep ocean, and they're saying that it's the cousin of or the ancestor of all whales and all dolphins. Now, Dorodon could swim in 3 dimensions, but for some reason science is saying that Dorodon and Basilosaurus are exactly the same, but Dorodon could swim in 3 dimensions and Basilosaurus couldn't. And I'm saying that Dorodon could well have been a version of a manatee, but they're not saying that. They're saying Dorodon was a Basilosaurus and it was the ancestor of all whales. Basilosaurus probably relied on unusual modes of locomotion relative to other cetaceans. Similarly sized thoracic, lumbar, sacral and caudal vertebrae imply that it moved in angular form fashion, but predominantly in the vertical plane. Paleontologist Gingrich theorised that Basilosaurus may also have moved in a very odd horizontal angular form fashion to some degree, something completely unknown in cetaceans. So again, the detailed evidence is telling us that none of these animals are anything like whales and dolphins. The vertebrae appear to have been hollow and likely also fluid filled. This would imply that Basilosaurus typically functioned in only 2 dimensions of the ocean surface compared with the 3-dimension habitats of actual whales and actual dolphins. Judging from the relatively weak axial musculature and the thick bones in the limbs, Basilosaurus is not believed to have been capable of sustained swimming or deep diving or moving on the land. So it couldn't move on the land. It was some kind of bottom feeder aquatic animal. Now, that's pretty disgusting, but I'm going to show you something. They're saying that it was like an eel. So recently in Britain, I think maybe just last year, they caught an eel and it was absolutely massive. So eels obviously grow for their whole lives. If they didn't grow for their whole lives, that eel wouldn't have been able to have reached the size that it reached, so it set a new record. So, and they're saying that Basilosaurus was an eel-like, it moved in an eel-like fashion, so maybe it was just a giant eel then. There's what that conger eel that was caught in Britain, that was what it looks like when it wasn't flat, it was stretched out. That's what it looked like, so it quite easily could have been Basilosaurus. It says that the eel was longer than some buses and has been caught off the coast of Britain. The 20-foot eel weighed 131 pounds after it was gutted and was caught off Plymouth and Devon. Fishermen caught it by mistake after it became tangled in the trawler's nets. Despite their size and power, they are not strong swimmers. So it moved like an eel. What's that saying they say? If it walks like a duck, it talks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Well, Basilosaurus moved like an eel. It only swam in 2 dimensions, and that's what eels do. So maybe it was a giant eel, because clearly eels do grow very, very large if they're undisturbed. You could say that Basilosaurus was a big, massive eel. Eels are thought to have a lifespan of over 150 years, so they probably grow all that time, had plenty of food around them, and there was nothing to disturb them. There was no natural predator to disturb them. They found this animal only this year. It's called a Desmostylion, and they were a big hippo-sized animal with a long snout and tusks. Now, what they found was that this animal's got a type of teeth and way of eating that is literally unknown in any other animal. So what I'm saying is that there are unique characteristics in certain animals. So some of the things that are perhaps unique in these animals, for example, the auditory bullion Pakicetus, that was the only thing that they could really say was anything like a whale or a dolphin. But Desmostylions prove that uniqueness, the Earth's flora and fauna and animals are capable of complete uniqueness. isolated uniqueness, and that's Pachycetus was a Masonichid. That's what I'm saying. It was a Masonichid, and its auditory bully could have just been an example of isolated uniqueness, and I'd say that was more likely than them trying to say that it's the ancestor of all whales and all dolphins. So Desmostylians were a hippo-sized animal with long snout and tusks. The new species is 23 million years old and has a unique tooth and jaw structure. These features indicate it was not only a vegetarian, but it literally sucked vegetation from shorelines like a vacuum cleaner. There is no other animal that has that eating method, or those teeth, or that mouth. What I'm saying is that Basilosaurus, I think that Basilosaurus actually probably was the biblical Leviathan, a very scary animal that lived in the sea, and that's the biblical images of the biblical Leviathan here. Strangely enough, okay, so the Leviathan is a monstrous being belonging to the Hebrew mythology, a mix between a sea serpent and a whale. Strangely enough, so people who were describing Leviathan in the Bible and Jewish mythology going back into the ancient times tells us that there was a Leviathan, and it was a mix between a sea serpent and a whale. In the Bible, Leviathan descriptions are read in different passages and represents a huge sea monster created by God and symbolizes evil. So I personally think that Basilosaurus is the biblical Leviathan. Now, another thing is that in Dorodon they're saying that it's got hind limbs, and that's an example of vestigial organs. Now, vestigial organs, again, at the textbook level they'll tell you vestigial organs is still a thing, but largely it has been completely discredited as a form of science. So whale pelvic bones actually do have a purpose. The muscles that control a cetacean's penis are attached to the creature's pelvic bones. Matthew Dean, assistant professor of the USC Donsfire College, spent 4 years examining whale and dolphin pelvic bones using a 3D laser scanner to study the shape and size of the samples in extreme detail. When Dean and Dines compared the relative size of pelvic bones with testes, they found that the bigger the testes, the bigger the pelvic bones. The competitive mating situation seemed to prompt the development of larger pelvic bones, making them not so useless after all. So the pelvic bones in whales and dolphins anchor their genitalia. To rule out overall skeleton size being the culprit behind larger pelvic bones, the duo also compared testes size with rib size and found no correlation, but there is a correlation between having a large pelvic bone and having large testes. So the idea about vestigial organs, which is still displayed on Wikipedia on Dorodon, saying that Dorodon's got these vestigial organs that used to be legs, which would have been present in Pachycetus and things, and that's what they're trying to say, but vestigial organs is actually a completely debunked part of science. Whale sex revealed useless hip bones are crucial to reproduction and size really matters. Study finds scientists from the University of Southern California and the Natural History Museum analysed pelvic bones for 4 years. Muscles that control a cetacean's penis attach directly to its pelvic bones. They found the bigger the animal's testes, the bigger the pelvic bone. This study changes the way we think about vestigial organs. It has long been thought that the hip bones of whales and dolphins are essentially useless, but scientists have now discovered that in fact the opposite is true, and that they are very important for mating in the species. So evolutionists all these years have been saying that the hip bones in whales and dolphins are vestigial. In fact, a lot of them have been saying that they expect the bones to disappear. And whales have been on the earth for 55 million years. It's actually 40 million years, as I've explained in previous video, but so in 40 million years the hip bones haven't disappeared, but that's what evolutionists were saying they expected. They expect the pelvic bones to disappear completely because they were vestigial, but now science is coming up with the complete opposite is true. Without these bones they wouldn't be able to have sex and they wouldn't be able to continue as a species. So the complete opposite of what evolutionists have proposed is the actual truth. I could go on about this. Robert Wiedersheim, he is the famous guy who started off this vestigial organs thing. He was a man that composed 86 vestigial organs for humans. Some of these I'll show you, right? It says the 13th rib of the adult, the 7th cervical rib in the adult, the flanges of your 5th toe, and less conspicuously of the 3rd and 4th toes. So you don't need flanges on your toes, you don't need a 13th rib according to Robert Wiedersheim. You don't need a cervical rib. Some of your facial muscles that You don't need some of them. You don't need hair. Men don't need nipples, according to him, which is not true. It's because the sex is undefined for a certain amount of time in the womb, and all human beings have nipples in case it is more estrogen that is produced in the womb, and then you'll become a woman, so you will need your nipples. So you start out in life with everybody having nipples in case you become a woman. You don't need your wisdom teeth, according to him. That's a vestigial organ and an example of evolution. You don't need your third premolar, you don't need your fourth premolar. So if it was up to Robert Widersham, humans would barely have teeth. You don't need certain valves for the veins, according to Robert Widersham. You don't need certain structures of the heart. Right. Okay, Robert. Males don't need a scrotum, according to Robert Widersham. Now again, I've explained that an encyclopedia is one of man's greatest works. An encyclopedia is an attempt to accumulate all the knowledge of man, and the encyclopedia is putting question marks next to what Robert Widersham is talking about. The encyclopedia, its main purpose is to find all information, and when Robert Widersham says a postfrontal bone is vestigial, the encyclopedia says, question mark, what the fuck are you talking about? The ossa interparietalia and the pre-interparietalia, question mark. The encyclopedia, the mass accumulation of all man's knowledge, do not know what the fuck Robert Widersham is talking about. And the alleged vestiges of mammary pouches again gets a question mark. So the encyclopedia, the accumulation of all man's knowledge, has no idea what Robert Widersham is talking about. Approximately 100 structures, including the appendix and the coccyx. As science progressed, it was discovered that all of the organs in Widersham's list in fact had very important functions. For instance, it was discovered that the appendix, which was supposed to be a vestigial organ, was in fact a part of the lymphatic system. A medical publication notes in 1997 that other bodily organs and tissues, the thymus, liver, spleen, appendix, bone marrow, and small collections of lymphatic tissue such as the tonsils in the throat and Peyer's patch in the small intestine, are also part of the lymphatic system, and they help fight infection. It was also discovered that the tonsils, which are also included in Widersham's list of vestigial organs, had a significant role in protecting the throat against infection, particularly until adolescence. It was found that the coccyx at the lower end of the vertebral column supports the bones around the pelvis and is the convergence point of some small muscles, and for this reason it would not be possible to sit comfortably without a coccyx. In the years that followed, it was realised that the thymus triggered the immune system in the human body by activating T cells, that the pineal gland was in charge of the secretion of some important hormones, that the thyroid gland was effective in providing steady growth in babies and children, and that the pituitary gland controlled the correct functioning of many hormone glands. All of these were once considered to be vestigial organs. Finally, the semi-lunar fold in the eye, which was referred to as a vestigial organ by Darwin, has been found in fact to be in charge of cleansing and lubricating the eye. No known functions in humans. The appendix has no known function in humans. Evidence suggests, this is from the BBC, evidence suggests that our evolutionary ancestors used their appendixes to digest tough food like tree bark. There's no evidence for that. There's no evidence that humans ate tree bark, or there's no evidence that the appendixes can help in digestion of such foods that aren't foods. But we don't use ours in digestion now. Some scientists believe that the appendix will disappear from the human body. Okay, so rich and in fighting lymphoid cells, the appendix is right. So the BBC have went from saying it's useless to now saying that it's rich in fighting lymphoid cells, because everyone supports the evolution theory just automatically without thinking about it. The appendix is rich in infection fighting lymphoid cells, suggesting that it might play a role in the immune system. Whether the appendix has a function or not, it can be removed without any ill effects. Scientists finally discovered the function of the human appendix. For generations, the appendix was thought to have no purpose, but now researchers say they have discovered the true function of this organ, and it is anything but redundant. Researchers now say that the appendix acts as a safe house for good bacteria. The body uses this to reboot the digestive system when one suffers from diarrhea. So if you go to vestigial organs and the encyclopedia again at the textbook level, animals, vestigial characters are present throughout the animal kingdom, and an almost endless list could be given. Darwin said that it would be impossible to name one of the higher animals in which some part or other is not a rudimentary condition. The wings of ostriches, emus, and other flightless birds are vestigial. They are remnants of their flying ancestors' wings. The eyes of certain cave fish and salamanders are vestigial, as they no longer allow the organism to see, and are remnants of their ancestors' functional eyes. Animals that reproduce without sex. Asexual reproductions generally lose their sexual traits, such as the ability to locate, recognise the opposite sex, and copulation behaviour. Boas and pythons have vestigial pelvis remnants which are externally visible as two small pelvic spurs on each side of the cloaca. These spurs are sometimes used in copulation but are not essential, as no colobroid snake possesses these remnants. So they're saying that the list of vestigial organs is endless, but all they can think of is flightless birds' wings, the eyes of cave fish and salamanders. Asexual reproduction. Now, asexual reproduction is not a choice. If you reproduce asexually, that is your main function, your primary mode. There's no way that you can change that. That's not a choice. There would be no other possible way of reproducing. If you couldn't reproduce, you would die out as an animal. So that's not an example of a vestigial organ. That's just a primary mode, a primary function, and there's nothing that you can do about it. They're saying that boas and pythons have vestigial pelvic remnants, but then in the very next sentence they say that they use the spurs to grip onto the mate to have sex. That's not all snakes have it, but some snakes do. Okay, so about the wings. What good are wings on a flightless bird like the ostrich? Although scientists have previously suggested temperature control and reproductive display as the main use of ostrich wings, a team reporting at the annual meeting of the Society for Experimental Biology believe it has determined their most important purpose. Moreover, the scientists connect their research to the study of winged dinosaurs. The team, led by the University of Antwerp's Nina Schaller, argues that ostriches do in fact use their wings to help them move, just not off the ground. Instead, the birds employ their wings as giant rudders, helping them manoeuvre and brake while running at high speeds. The researchers arrived at the conclusions through extensive study of ostriches raised by Schaller herself, along with airstream experiments. Of special interest is that ostriches' interarsal muscle, once considered rudimentary, has an important role in allowing the birds to execute such manoeuvres at high speed zigzag running. This team supports their claims with evidence from the ostrich-like rhea, another flightless bird whose wings are used similarly to execute rapid zigzagging as a means of escape and use their wings to maintain balance during these agile manoeuvres. So flightless birds don't have vestigial wings, they use them in their daily lives and they're important to the survival of the species. Asexual reproduction is not a vestigial organ, it's a primary mode of function. So this is the advantages of asexual reproduction. Asexual reproduction means that you can reproduce without a mate. It means that you don't need to have time and energy to look for a mate. It means that you can produce a large number of offspring rapidly. It means that you can spread and colonise an area in a short amount of time. It means if you're confined to a small space on your own, you can still reproduce. And it means that, well, that's not an advantage, having a stable environment. So examples of asexually reproducing organisms: amoebas, hydras, mushrooms, bacteria, archaea, protists, sea anemones, coral, starfish, some non-flowering plants, strawberry, onions and potatoes, all reproduce asexually. There's no possible way that they could change that, but in a desperate attempt to talk about vestigial organs, which supposedly the list of vestigial organs would be endless, the examples that they do choose are wrong. Pelvic spurs are used by boas and pythons to have sex. Asexual reproduction is not a choice, it's a primary mode of function. It's nothing to do with vestigial organs. Ostriches, emus and other flightless birds do still use their wings, so none of these so-called endless list are anything but vestigial, and vestigial organs in general is a completely debunked concept. Okay, so finally, just as a short and precise summary of what we've just seen in this video, and a succinct summary of what science currently regards as the evolution of all whales and all dolphins. On the left I'll show you the actual bones that were found, and on the right I'll show you the most succinct descriptions of the animals that we have. So Pakicetus, there's the bones there on the left, that's the bones that we currently know about. It was found in small stone deposits amongst the bones of several other mammals. It was originally described as a mesonechid, so the people who originally found the bones of Pakicetus described it as just a dog-like animal that lived many thousands or millions of years ago in Pakistan. That's all they thought it was. It's a composite skeleton of 4 different types, what they believe is 4 different types of Pakicetus. It's not a complete skeleton, it's a composite skeleton that has the bones of 4 different types of Pakicetus to make up what they have on the left there. It lived in fresh water, not salt water. The overwhelming majority of whales and dolphins live in salt water. They don't live in fresh water. There is a small, maybe 2 or 3 species of dolphin that live in fresh water, but apart from that all whales and all dolphins live in salt water, and there's a big difference in the physiological makeup between fish that can survive in salt water and fish that can survive in fresh water. And Pakicetus didn't venture anywhere near salt water. It lived on the land and it sometimes hunted in fresh water, and despite evidence of it being a fast land mammal, the bones showed that it was a fast land mammal. We are now officially describing it as a whale. Ambulocetus, there's the bones of Ambulocetus on the left there, the bones that we know about. In textbooks it's described as a walking whale, however bone studies show that it could not pronate or supinate at its elbows. It could not walk, although it may have had limited movement on land like seals, so if it couldn't pronate or supinate then it couldn't walk. Those are what bones have to do to allow an animal to walk. Ambulocetus couldn't do that, so it couldn't walk, and could have went on the land like seals. Seals can have a small amount of movement on land, they can drag themselves about, it's nothing great. Sea lions can actually walk on the land if they want to. It lived in fresh water again, not salt water, so it's unlike all whales and dolphins in that sense. It didn't actually have the same swimming movement as whales and dolphins. Ambulocetus also had protruding eyes at the top of its skull, which is unknown for any mammals, and it's actually usually seen in reptiles like a crocodile, the eyes high up on the skull and protruding upwards. And scientists don't actually know where to place Ambulocetus on the scale between Pakicetus and whales, so despite all the evidence they don't actually know currently where it would sit in the sequential order of things. Cucucetus, there's the bones there on the left that we do know about. It's actually a composite skeleton of 2 completely different animals, 2 completely different genera. It didn't have the same swimming movement as whales and dolphins, and again it lived in fresh water, not salt water, so it's unlike the overwhelming majority of all whales and dolphins in that sense. Protocetus, we don't actually have, very little is known of the Protocetus skeleton. That's some of the example of what they have found on Protocetus on the left there. It's not because they know so little about the skeleton, they don't actually know what swimming movement it did actually have, so we can't really compare it to whales and dolphins in that sense. And again, scientists currently don't know where to place Protocetus on the scale between Pakicetus and whales, so that's the main bulk of the line that leads to whales and dolphins, and they don't actually know the swimming movements of all of them. They're composite skeletons, they're not complete skeletons. Basically all of them live in fresh water, not salt water. They're completely different to whales and dolphins in all known manners. And finally we've got Dorodon and Basilosaurus. Now they do have the complete skeletons for Dorodon and Basilosaurus. They're the only animals in the whale evolution line for which the complete skeletons are known. Officially, however, Basilosaurus and Dorodon are not considered as ancestors of whales, but they are a similar animal that diverged from the same line. So Even scientists officially would say that Basilosaurus and Dorodon are not the ancestors of whales, but they might say that they diverged from the same line of animals. So the only animals that they have the complete skeletons for are not actually anything to do with whales and dolphins, and the animals that they're saying are the ancestors of all whales and all dolphins, they don't even have the complete skeletons for them. Dorodon and Basilosaurus are considered to be different species of the same animal, so I guess a comparison would be like a jaguar and a lynx, or a jaguar and a cheetah, something like that. They're both large cats, but they're not exactly the same. Even though they're considered to be the same animal, Basilosaurus has a completely unique swimming motion known for any mammal, and it's described as swimming similar to an eel. Another thing is, despite the fact that they're saying they're the same animal, Basilosaurus can't swim in 3 dimensions, it can't dive down to the depths of the ocean, and it's considered a poor swimmer, whereas Dorodon can. So even though they officially say that Dorodon and Basilosaurus are the same animal, Basilosaurus can't even actually swim in 3 dimensions, and whales and dolphins obviously are probably the best swimming mammals. Evidence also shows that Dorodon could replace some of its teeth, and that's extremely rare for mammals. It's not known in any mammals that live in the sea, it's only known in a couple of land mammals for mammals to replace their teeth. So if you think that is enough evidence to say that all whales and all dolphins, it's all complete, it's all legitimate, if you think that that's enough evidence to say that these animals are definitely the ancestors of all whales and dolphins, then that's a decision that you have to make personally. But I certainly don't think that, now that you know this, I think that science is kind of trying to hoodwink people into saying that it's completely legitimate and it's a well researched and well devised model of how mammals went into the sea. If evolution is true, then mammals started on the land and then they went into the sea, and they're saying that this is all very well researched, but the actual evidence just doesn't stack up. Okay, thanks for watching. Bye.